in a meeting, he might not answer. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. State Board will come back to order. Would you call the roll, please?
Board Member Durham, on his way, probably. Excused, okay. Board Member Flores, also excused. Board Member Goff.
Here.
Board Member McClellan.
Here.
Board Member Rankin.
Here.
Board Member Shuffle.
Here.
Board Member Schroeder.
Here.
Thank you. We have a quorum.
Actually, I don't know what a quorum is. Is it 4 or 5?
Board Member Flores just walked in.
Good morning. First item on our agenda this morning is Part 2 of the Standards Review and Revision Presentation. Commissioner?
Yes, thank you. I'll ask Dr. Colsman and Dr. Cobb to come up, and they will start us with our presentation.
Yeah, we like those lights.
Rebecca that found them.
It's so hot.
It is freezing in here. Wait a minute,
I
actually.
have Hashimoto's.
over. No.
Yeah. Yeah, I did. I mean,
Well, I got it. Yeah.
seriously?
Choreography got off on that one.
No, but this thing made me.
I got all confused. Well, good morning, everyone. So this is our Part 2 of our Standards Review and Revision Process Information Update. Today we're presenting computer science final recommendations as well as final recommendations from world languages. So today you'll have 2 notebooks. I'm doing the notebook orientation, by the way. So today you have 2 notebooks, one for computer science, which is what we're starting with, and one for world languages. One thing I would like feedback on towards the end of our presentation, after we do computer science and world languages, we'll have an opportunity for some feedback. So I'd like you to be thinking about, because this will be a little bit different than yesterday, because yesterday you were in one binder. And so when you opened your tab for the March materials, there was the materials for everything you needed yesterday. But now we're split across 2 content areas. So what we did is we just duplicated everything so that the March Materials tab, which is tab number 5, has the full PowerPoint, has the memo again, and also has the information sheet for each of those 2 subject areas. That feels like it's redundant, so I'm just going to be asking for you, just like from a point of organization, what would work better for you in the future. But in any case, go ahead and if you'd like to turn to tab 5, your meeting materials. So in there you'll find the memo again, because it's a lovely memo, so we wanted you to have multiple copies of it. And you'll find the PowerPoint presentation, and behind that, and this would be something you might want to pull out, as I am demonstrating, is the overview sheet for computer science, because this is going to be what our chair kind of walks through for computer science. And will be kind of the focus of the presentation. Again, your notebook does have underneath the tab number 3, you'll see the actual draft of the computer science standards. Under tab 2, you'll see the committee members. And just as yesterday when there was a tab for feedback, under tab 4, you'll see all of the feedback that was received. So, with that kind of little notebook orientation, we'll go ahead and begin. Again, so Floyd and I will stay up here for both presentations, but then we'll call up the relevant committee members. So our presentation purpose is just as yesterday, so I won't go over this, which is essentially to provide you with the feedback from the committee to your responses to the computer science standards, as well as major public feedback. So I'll go ahead and hand off to Dr. Cobb, who will take us through the remainder of our presentation.
All right. Well, it gives me pleasure to introduce Axel Reitzig. He's to my right, the computer science and committee chairperson for robotics. and Computer Science Coordinator in St. Vrain Valley School District, as well as Dr. Joanna Bruno, who is our Science Content Specialist here at CDE. The format will follow exactly the same as what we did yesterday, so I will turn it over to Axel.
Good morning. I'm here to share the full Computer Science Committee recommendations. A listing of our committee can be found under tab 2 in your notebooks. As you know, the work of this committee was different than the other subjects, since this was a standards development process for voluntary 912 standards. And if I can bring your attention to tab 3 in the notebooks, you'll find the full booklet of the standards we've developed. And on page 4 of that booklet, we've included the 3 computer science standards definitions. Our first standard is computational thinking. The definition is, computational thinking includes concepts related to the use of algorithms and data in different ways to generate new knowledge and articulate solutions to real-world problems. Our second standard is computing systems and networks. This includes concepts related to the development and communication between software and hardware, and systems thinking around data protection and recovery. And our third standards area is computer programming, which includes concepts related to creating computer programs and applications, working collaboratively to engage in client-based problem solving, and internet security. We've also included an overview of the development process of these standards for your reference. So moving on from there, if you can look at tab 5 at the back of your documents, you'll find the final recommendations overview for computer science. And I believe Melissa has indicated the page where that is found. The first section includes responses to state board feedback we received in December. So the one question we had, the main one was, are we building in flexibility across grade levels? We discussed this as a committee and really felt we have worked hard over the course of the year to build in flexibility and ensure that these standards are nimble enough for all districts across the state. So an example of this is in our computer programming standard. There's an evidence outcome, which is analyze and apply a design methodology to identify constraints and requirements of an identified problem. So the standard allows for choice of a design methodology and for an identified problem. So this would give or afford teachers flexibility to fit it to their needs of their specific classrooms. We also worked to make sure the standards were written to reflect varying depths of knowledge. So this would allow teachers to effectively meet the needs of a variety of students and grade levels. And finally, we designed the standards in order to ensure they remained relevant over the course of changing technologies. An example of this would be the evidence outcome, identify and create different types of algorithms, sort or search, for example. And this comes out of Standard 1, GLE 1, and it's the evidence outcome A. So the concept reflected in this evidence outcome won't change over the course of the next few years, even though some of the related technologies might. And since this is a very fast-changing field, we felt that was important to address. As the committee worked on finalizing these recommendations in general, we were able to reach consensus fairly easily. We sometimes had to work out differences, but for the most part engaged in a constructive and lively dialogue. We resolved any disagreements by reviewing our overall goals, as well as the structure of Colorado's academic standards. Our committee also had received an excellent training in the process of group collaboration and reaching consensus. I'd like to remark that this was a very experienced, professional, and committed group of stakeholders which worked very well as a team. I would now like to ask each member of the board to refer to the next section of the final recommendations overview document titled Notable Changes Based on Public Comments. It's the bottom part of the page that Melissa indicated earlier. So the main public feedback we received was for us to consider including more computer science ethics and accessibility more explicitly in the standards. We agreed and we're able to add 3 additional evidence outcomes to meet this request. These additional evidence outcomes were added to grade level expectation 5 in standard 3. So the first evidence outcome is D, identify influential computing innovations and identify the beneficial and harmful effects they have had or could have on society, economy, and culture. The second one, E, discuss and explain how diversity of design and issues of accessibility impact a wide range of users. And F, demonstrate ways to improve the accessibility of computational technologies and artifacts. So any public feedback that we received was welcome. And in addition to having focus group feedback prior to beginning this work, the second round of public feedback offered 142 responses from 15 users. Since these standards are a new set, the committee did our best to meet the needs of the various groups that offered their thoughts. I think that is it.
All right, that concludes this presentation. Questions?
Comments, questions? Go ahead. I'm just looking at you. Go ahead.
Can you talk about the relationship between these standards and the ISTE standards, which are teacher prep? So, I mean,
Yes.
does that kind of align, or is there a crosswalk, or do they not really necessarily mutually inform?
So the ISTE standards informed our work considerably, but they were one of several resources that we looked at, including the newly revised CSTA standards and the K-12 computer science framework. So ISTE standards address probably more directly digital citizenship, which when we began this process last summer, we felt is already being addressed within the state, because we do have a CDE member who takes the lead on that. And also felt that computer science, we needed a more narrow focus on the actual practices of computer science, so programming, design, those kinds of things too. So ISTE was an influential aspect of our work, and some elements have been incorporated, particularly like the ethics component, but it wasn't exclusively what we drew on to work on our standards.
So the teachers that will teach to these standards, I mean, I was just trying to review this myself for our university. There's not like a license for STEM, which includes technology. So the teachers that teach to this, how are they prepared? I mean, they're licensed in math, or they're licensed in, or they just have a background in computer programming and science? Just trying to figure out.
Yeah,
what they
it's
could do.
a mix right now.
How do you teach
Yeah.
this?
So in my district, we have a variety of people. We have some people who have a professional background in programming and then came to teaching. We have people who studied this or math, a related field, and maybe then were a math or science teacher and then became computer science teachers. And then we have teachers who don't have a background in those fields at all. For example, a language arts teacher, but they got interested in doing computer science and made that change. Because of the demand for having these teachers, we look for people who have a strong interest and are willing to work hard. In our district, we've provided over 2,500 hours of professional development over the last 4 years to support our teachers to kind of learn how to do this. We currently have a collaborative group of about 20 teachers, K-12, so they can refine these skills. And I know, there's a lot of work to be done in this area too, but I think the state will be providing some guidance in this.
Yes, there's, if I may, Madam Chair.
Please, yes.
We currently have a digital literacy endorsement that we've looked at for teachers, and it needs to include more of the computer science components that are in the standards. So that'll be something we look to the future for, to potentially revise, to really include more of this. But as Axel said, districts are in a place where they're just choosing teachers to teach these courses. Some have computer science background directly. Some are coming from the field. But as far as an endorsement, a licensed endorsement, we don't currently have a STEM one or a full computer science endorsement for teachers. But that is something that the committee is recommending to move forward, and that's something that we're looking at.
Okay, thank you.
To what extent is that necessary as opposed to having all of our teachers have a certain level of skills so that some of these standards are actually integrated in the teaching of other subjects, and it's just a part of it?
If I may too, there's part of the computer science recommendation from the committee includes computer science practices, and those practices overlap with mathematics and science practices that are being recommended by those two committees.
Good.
So there is integration in the practice components, the processes and practices. So there's points of integration at that point. Also within part of the statute, it asked that we include 21st century skills that have components of the computer science. So currently in the 21st century skills in statute, it was more focused around digital literacy. So they expanded that to be more inclusive of other things. So all the content areas had to look at that and include those essential skills in their standards document. So there's a point of integration.
Thank you.
May I add to that? One thing we've learned in our district is it depends which level we're looking at. So elementary is very much makes sense to focus on integration. Just it's the best way to address computer science or bringing computer science in. So that looks different than, let's say, high school, where you have the opportunity to have standalone courses.
Classes.
I think that's where computer science endorsement would have impact, because then we can elevate the quality of the instruction. Middle school is kind of a blend of the two, is what we've learned.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Board Member Rankin.
On your committee response, demonstrate ways to improve the accessibility of computational technologies and artifacts. I'm caught on the word artifacts. That, to me, is going backwards, and computers are going forward. So can you kind of explain that to me?
Artifacts is a commonly used word, a product that is produced by a student. So that could be code, it could be a robotic device. So it does have a connotation of archaeology, I guess. Is that maybe, I think how you, but it's just a product that someone has produced as a result.
Could it be a project also, where the person has integrated like some CAD skills into a project that they are reporting on?
In my opinion, yes. I don't know if the board, so yeah.
So it's just integrating what computers do with whatever you're working on at the time.
Yes, it's the application of the knowledge and skills towards that real world kind of problem, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Board Member Sheffield.
When the department looks at math licensure programs, do they review them against these also because of the STEM, or is it just math? I mean, is there like a connection conceptually or not really?
So each content area licensure standards are really focused only on that particular content area and is more related to directly to, like, for instance, math would be related to the mathematics standards. I think that with as Joanna noted, that idea of the practices that kind of transcend across these subject areas, you might see a bit more of that, but those would be strictly reviewed with respect to math, unless there's a change of in some way.
Okay, thank you.
Board Member Rankin.
Ms.
Do
Colesman,
you have your hand? I just can't tell. Yes?
Go ahead.
Ms. Colesman, I have a question about these brand new standards. Now, this is something new, and it really, it changes so rapidly, but we don't review these for another 6 years? Is that where this is? I mean, I just think of 6 years in computer life is a long time. Can we revisit these if we find there are some?
So the way the statute reads is that the state board needs to review on or before a particular date, so it does give that flexibility.
Good.
So if a couple years down the road we see that, wow, there's some changes that need to be made, there's nothing to prohibit the board from revisiting these on a shorter time frame.
I have to just add, too, that sitting in even on that one class, it was so interesting to hear the teachers discuss the different levels that students come to the table in technology. And I'm sure it's with languages and other things, but some students just grab onto this, and when they're 15 years old, you know, Bill Gates, let's say, and you're in a classroom with the beginners and Bill Gates. What a challenge that is. maybe blended learning could help with some of that. But
We have a lot of discussions about that, and we were attentive to the concern you're raising, which is understanding this is a really fast-changing field, and we didn't want to write standards which would then hold back or inhibit teaching in 3 years, knowing also that the statute doesn't allow typically for revision except for 7 years. Okay. And so, so that flexibility question which you posed to us the last time I was here, we did review, and we feel like we did a good job of making these flexible enough that we should be okay for the next 7 years.
And just one more question. Did you look at other states and what they have for their standards in computer science?
We did. We looked at a wide range. There was a report that was produced for us by CDE and NERI Research. And so we looked at state of Massachusetts, which has a very mature kind of statewide framework, state of Washington, Arkansas, also again the K-12 framework, which was recently revised. It's a national endeavor. And then the CSTA, which is the Computer Science Teachers Association. They've been the leaders in designing computer science standards, so they recently revised theirs as well. So we looked at all of those when we kind of started this off.
I think this is really a good piece of work. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
Board Member Goff?
Good morning. This is real. Better?
Yeah.
Thank you. I can't hear anything right now. General question, and we could even base it on St. Vrain right now. That's a good sized district. If professional development were to be more of a maybe a universal offering, a possibility and such, and you mentioned, I believe you have 20 elementary teachers right now that are in professional development, or they are sort of trained to be trainers, or at what point. But overall in St. Vrain, or what you know of other districts in Colorado, what level, is there any one level that has more of a need for people to get into the mix, to get going on some professional development opportunities, or in combination with what a lot of teachers are doing now within the math and within science and within actually the whole digital literacy pool of thinking? How many teachers are needed? And if you had a chance to express at what level you think they would be most needed right away, so that more districts could embark on making the standards more than just voluntary.
I think that's a great question. So where's the most pressing need? Probably high school, just to bolster what we offer at that level. And we all know there's a great shortage of people going into these fields to fill the jobs that are there and make the best of the opportunities that these jobs offer. So if we can, at this point right now, grab student interest at the high school level to encourage them to consider that as a direction for their profession, either a college track or maybe some kind of CTE associate's degree track, I think that would be impactful. Longer term, I think it's sort of an equal need. In my opinion, the earlier you start, the better. We view computer science as a fourth literacy. We think it's essential for the success of our students once they finish K-12. And so, like any literacy, the younger you can introduce students to these concepts and these skills, the better. And that looks different for each grade, every level. So elementary will look, of course, different from high school. And that takes some intentional planning. And I'm fortunate to be in a district where we have strong leadership and understanding of these issues and support to kind of try to find solutions.
In your high schools in St. Vrain specifically, are there high school teachers right now who are purely computer science instructors?
Yes, it's a mix. So each, it's very local control, of course, like Colorado is. And we've had some high schools where for probably 5-6 years, they've really invested in a full-time or more than one full-time position to do computer science. We have others that maybe have a half-time position. We have a couple that have no one at this time. However, I think in the next year or two, every school should have at least a half-time FTE dedicated towards teaching computer science at the high school level.
Okay, and one more. Among whether their title is librarian or digital learning specialist or technician, how many primarily librarian-based professionals are expected to be or do take the role of the computer science head in the building? I'm just thinking.
In our district, probably fewer. That's probably more at the high school level, it would be less a librarian role, and that's something more assigned to a classroom teacher. At the elementary level is where you would really see the librarians taking the lead in providing that. And I think that's a very interesting question because in my experience, our informal learning spaces, like after-school clubs and libraries and maker spaces, really have generated enthusiasm and interest in this field, and that's been a great starting point. So we're trying to figure out how to leverage those spaces and then make that more part of the regular school day.
Congratulations on the successes in St. Vrain.
Thank you.
And other
Appreciate that.
places. But it's been really fun to follow all of the things that you've been doing there. Much appreciated.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
Board Member Flores?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask you about MOOC. Are there any MOOC courses that maybe high school teachers or elementary teachers could take? Because those, I think, would really help if, say, a district does not offer them, but, or are those, came to mind that they may be too advanced, but are there some that would be at the level of teachers at high school or, public school teaching?
There are a lot of internet-based resources. Code Academy, for example, is one I know teachers have used, or Code.org has built some really great curriculum that's very accessible to the average teacher who doesn't have a background in computer science. So we do, and I think Christine Liba, who will be the CDE computer science coordinator, is building that resource bank and will leverage a lot of those free and high quality resources that are out there.
That's great.
So probably it's more a matter of how to make it accessible and guide people to the best resource for what their needs are.
Yeah.
To let you know, we recently have talked with the University of Colorado, and they've been building professional masters and professional certifications. And we said, hey, this sounds like something that could work really well for our needs. So it looks like they're on the way to offer the first professional certificate in K-12 computer science, which would focus on cybersecurity. We're hoping that will begin in January of 2019. And we've had discussion there about making that a blended or online opportunity that could be available to any teacher who could benefit from it.
I'm just wondering if Alexa has just taken a leg up and possibly could teach all of us. I know it was trying to tell us what to do yesterday. At least.
That was Siri.
At least, Board Member
That was
Durham.
Siri.
That was, Siri.
Siri took over. She took over
Sorry.
yesterday.
Which was a little, Thank you.
Yes, I hope I answered your question.
Thank you very much. Any more questions, folks? Thank you. Appreciate all your hard work.
The Alexis and the Siri's taking over, I don't know.
Just follow.
Do you like my name on here?
Okay.
Hi.
Hi. And we'd like to introduce our guest from the World Language Committee. To my right is Jane Erickson, or Janine Erickson, I apologize, reading too fast again. Trainer and retired educator. Kelly Parkhurst, also a trainer and retired educator. And to her right is Lulu Buck, our English Language Development and World Language Content Specialist here at CDE. I will turn it over to the committee.
Good morning, members of the Colorado State Board of Education. We're here to represent our committee, and the committee membership is under tab 2 in your notebook. We had such a great synergy in our committee work in arriving at consensus for all decisions. We felt very supported by the Colorado Department of Education through the training that the chairs initially received, which created a synergistic framework to support the work in arriving at consensus for all revisions made to our standards. Transparency was very important to us, and we created a number of partnerships with professionals in the field. This supported our communication to the field, as well as providing us with ample feedback to guide our work. I think our over 8,000 comments from stakeholders shows how strong our partnership with the field is. Just like the other subjects, we will walk through the following bullets for world languages, beginning with review of notable revisions to the standards, responses to questions and feedback from state board members on initial recommendations, overview of themes from public feedback, questions from state board members, proposed amendments from state board members. Now I would like to ask each board member to please refer to the final recommendations overview document, which is under tab 5 of your notebook. As you see, we begin with the notable changes that we discussed last time we presented. Notable changes from the current standards include the addition of optional preschool standards. Revisions have been made to the prepared graduate competencies. I'm sorry.
If you're having a hard time finding that, it's the final sheet in section 5, the very last sheet.
Right, it has a red tab. Right.
Got it.
Sorry. Should I start over with the notable changes? Are we okay? Right. I'll wait till they have.
Mine says world language. I'll share.
I don't have world language either. I just have computer.
Sorry.
Okay. So I'm on the third bullet, addition of range level proficiency expectations for the intermediate level. Addition of an intermediate high range to the current levels of intermediate low and intermediate mid. And as a reminder, the world language standards are organized by range levels instead of grade levels. So no matter what grade a student begins to learn another language, they would begin as a novice and progress through each level as they become more proficient in the language. And the last bullet is the addition of an advanced low proficiency range. To finalize these recommendations, all 12 members of the committee participated in every session, and everyone was given an opportunity to offer the perspective before final decisions were made. Each meeting, the committee would end the day by coming together in a large circle and looking over each section page by page. This way, the full committee could read the edits, ask questions of the writers that made the suggestions, and recommend edits around clarity, alignment, or other observations. Each small writing team would make note of these suggestions and make the changes when they went back to their writing group. This process was successful because it made sure all committee members' perspectives were considered.
I would like to ask each member of the board to please refer to the second section of the final recommendations overview document. Responses to the state board questions and comments on initial revisions recommendations. In the first comment, there was a request to explain the scale used in the standards. The foreign language in elementary schools, or FLES, is one to consider. And this is how our committee responded. The scale in Colorado's World Languages Standards have 5 levels. There are 3 levels for novice learners of a foreign language: novice low, novice mid, and novice high. There are 2 levels for intermediate learners of a foreign language. intermediate low, intermediate mid. This scale is the standard for language levels across the country. The proficiency levels exist independently of grade levels. For example, the novice range applies to all students beginning to learn a second language, which may occur at any age. As students move across the proficiency continuum with supporting learner targets through the proficiency ranges, the content and context becomes more complex in the domains of language functions, vocabulary, text type, language control, communication strategies, and cultural competence. The next comment expressed a concern about the introduction of a foreign language at the preschool level. Our committee responded with the following. Preschool standards are optional standards. There have been ongoing requests for this option in school systems that offer this type of programming.
And I would like to ask each member of the board to please refer to the next section of the final recommendations overview document titled Notable Changes Based on Public Comments. So the public feedback indicated a need to align the standards to the most recent resources from the National Council of State Supervisors for Languages and the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. And the committee responded in agreement. All standards were reviewed, and where applicable, revisions were based on alignment to these new resources were made. The committee aligned the standards using the 2017 benchmarking report suggestions and public feedback regarding the very recent resources to ensure the standards were aligned to high-performing states and nations per CAP 4K. The statements are aligned with the findings of the benchmarking report for a greater alignment to reflect the continuum of growth in communication skills through novice, intermediate, and advanced levels. Public feedback indicated a need to add an intermediate high proficiency range level. The committee agreed. Current range level options were extended to include an intermediate high proficiency range level. Public feedback also indicated a need to add an advanced low proficiency range level, and the committee agreed. The current range level options were extended to include an advanced low proficiency range level. So I will address both of these proficiency range levels with one response. In accordance with the Colorado legislative requirements that the standards be comparable in scope, relevance, and rigor to the highest national and international standards, and upon the recommendation of the benchmarking report as well as the public feedback, the current range level options were extended to include these two higher proficiency range levels. The description of ranges of performance at these levels allows users to identify appropriate learning targets for language learners who begin at any age or grade level and whose language learning continues for varying amounts of time.
The committee appreciated the amount of public responses they received. For your reference, in the first round of public feedback, there were 879 comments by 14 people, which increased to 8,083 comments from 70 people from the field. The increase in comments and users provided a large majority of agreement, 7,496, 104 neutral comments, and 448 disagreements. Many of the items representing disagreement have been considered, and the new revisions are meant to address any of these comments. We would like to thank each one of you for your time and consideration.
Thank you. Colleagues, comments? Board Member Rankin.
When you were working on these, you talk about the mid-level, the different, is that new, or was there there has to be some type of breakout in the earlier standards? I just wonder how it's different.
It's basically the same.
Okay.
It's exactly the same. We just added the two ones. The high
Okay,
and
so what I hear is a mild tweaking of this rather than big, huge revision. But how do you account for, maybe I heard this wrong, 879 people to over 8,000? Did I hear that
Not
right?
people, but
I mean,
So it was-
comments, yeah.
Yes, comments,
Yeah,
yes.
the people went
Yes.
up to 79, but a huge amount of interest there for any direct reason, or it just seems like an inordinate amount of?
I think that our profession is really united, and they're united behind our standards, and
So they
feel
had
that
more
it's-
people jumped in there?
Yes,
Yeah,
very
okay.
enthusiastic, yes, to support us in our work.
Board Member Goff?
Language people and those interested in loving languages like to talk and express themselves.
Yes.
You know, and gesticulate as well. Just a quick comment, thank you very much. I'm so excited. I'm excited for you, and I just think it's the embellishment and the enhancement of what's always been a really strong approach and outlook on what's possible for kids. My only, kind of a review question for myself, the level additions, or the low, intermediate, and the higher level, was that primarily to speak directly to AP kids that it really do advance beyond what the traditional level 4 is all about, so that if they continue on, is that something that I can use to explain that if I need, without having firsthand experience right now? And the other part of that, I would just wonder if there's been enough time yet to draw some conclusions or have some data around the influence of the seal of biliteracy. This would be particularly at the high school level. Has that, you see any, have you had time to see whether there's some correlation between kids involved in those programs and their performance levels?
I can address the first part of your question, to speak about the extended levels. This allows for a longer sequence of learning, beginning in the elementary grades and continuing on beyond that. And at the same time, it also meets the needs of heritage and native language learners. So the programs are extending in our state. We're seeing more dual language immersion starting in the elementary grades, or full immersion programs, FLES programs that Kelly referred to earlier, as foreign language in elementary schools. That's what FLES stands for. And so these standards increases the flexibility for implementing all education institutes in Colorado. And the seal of biliteracy is really new yet, and districts are at this point seeing how they can make that work for themselves, because it has to be attached to some kind of an assessment so that they can qualify for that. And each district has different choices for assessments. Again,
Yes,
local control.
I know.
For that.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you. I was just wondering about FLES. You just mentioned FLES. Is there a resurgence of a need for FLES? That's very exciting.
What is that,
And
please?
that's the foreign language in the elementary schools, which was so big in the 50s and the 60s, but that's wonderful to hear. I know that when I was teaching at the University of Northern Colorado, there was a great, no, this was in the 90s, that there was a resurgence of FLES, and that's wonderful.
Again, that is, I don't think it's really died as much. It's still there, but the dual language immersion is popping up
Right.
more, because more and more research has been done on starting in the earliest level possible. But we don't have the statistics on how many FLES programs there are, I don't believe, in Colorado, but they're there. And the FLES teachers end up moving from school to school still. I think we can still find them, but I'm not sure of
Yeah.
statistics.
That's great, thank you. And another question, it's basically not to you, but probably, I know that I go to the main library over here, and I want to read something about what, philosophy or reading in Spanish, and I think that there's levels or books for little kids and maybe for the intermediate, but I think we have such a large population that really reads and wants to know, what is literature, maybe in at least in Spanish, and Latin America is right there, and I just never find it. Never find anything new. I mean, if you go back to the big Spanish writers and such, and usually a big university, I know at the University of Texas in Austin, I mean, the professors were usually teaching the latest. And I know when I go to Boulder, sometimes I will find, that, but I wish that our local library would have that available. Literature and, just other thought like philosophy and such, and what's going on in that language and in those cultures. And if you could do something about that, that would be wonderful. I would love it.
I believe we're in charge of libraries, so we better be careful here. Board Member Sheffield.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you too. Do you find this, sometimes anecdotally, you'll talk to high school students or whatever and say, are you taking a language? I'll say, yes, I've taken X number of years of Spanish usually. And then a lot of times, or sometimes it'll be like, so can you speak it? And it'll be, well, I can speak a little bit and I can read a little bit, but I'm struggling, and I'm just wondering if these standards subserve higher achievement in mastering a foreign language. Because ideally, you'd want students to take X number of credit hours and get to this advanced, is advanced low the highest level, or advanced high? Whatever. Anyway, they'd get to whatever level, and they'd feel fluent in terms of speaking and also in reading. And I just wonder how the standards have evolved over time, because I haven't reviewed the previous iteration of this. And does it subserve kids actually being able to answer that question differently, which is, yes, I can communicate with ease in another language.
That is a statement we hear so frequently that I took 2 years of a language and I can't speak a word.
Right.
And so because we hear that in the field, there was a very intense national study done back in 2007, 2008, and finalized in 2009 with a position statement that teachers should use the target language in the classroom 90% of the time. And to follow up on that, you'll see an abundance of professional development sessions as to how can we do this. Now that as a teacher, we need to be proficient ourselves in teaching the language. So it does require that skill to start with. And then the methodologies that follow to support using the target language 90%, they're varied different methodologies that can be used. But it is building and growing and expanding so much so that it is changing that sentence. It's changing the answer to that question to yes. And we are definitely seeing strength right here in Colorado. We have a very strong we have a really strong polling for attending the conference, the state conference, and almost all the sessions are dealing with how to use the target language in the classroom. So it's growing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for all your hard work.
One
Oh,
quick-
sorry, Ms. Goff.
Just such a timely thing. I read in some publication within the last day or two that, and I believe it's local, one of the canine units, dogs that help law enforcement do various things, there has been an increased interchange with European countries. So European countries we're exchanging dogs. And now it's locally that you can communicate with a canine, one of the dogs, in Hungarian. So there's all the more reason to be prepared for having another language, at least one, at your disposal. So appreciate it. Hungarian canines. Yes. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, folks. I've never seen Hungarian.
Yeah. So Board Member Goff, I'm convinced my cat speaks Hungarian because he will not listen to anything I say.
Well, I didn't really make that real clear. What the report was that dogs respond in Hungarian. Wow. Yeah, I want to go find some.
Their sound, they're just bright. Dogs are so smart.
Are we
we just have a little break?
Well, we're going to,
Sorry.
we have 2 more slides, very quick
Oh,
ones,
I'm so
so just wanted
Please.
to, I know.
My apologies.
Just very quickly, just wanted to kind of remind you of what next steps are. In April, then, what will happen is the committees that you heard from today for an information item will come to you in April for final approval. But then you're going to get the next batch of new standards. And so all of the standards are now actually available. All of the recommendations, the final recommendations for every other content area, not just those that we're bringing forward in April. So we'll be sending you a link like we did last time for those, and we'll also have printed copies for you. And then as a reminder, we're going to be asking that by the agenda posting date for April, if you have any amendments for social studies, science, and mathematics, that you have them by agenda posting date, so that can be part of the discussion for those information items. The science will allow, there's going to be 2 information items, both in April and in May, so we'll have an extended amount of time for any amendments and discussion around that because of the change. The last thing I just wanted to do is just ask about some feedback about how the presentations are working for you, how the notebooks are working for you, and to see if there's any just quick feedback. Of course, we'll take any other feedback beyond right now, but I just wanted to get a sense of how this worked for you.
Board Member Sheffel.
I think it works great. My question is, when is the date again that you have to get comments back to us on these other next set?
For April, you will, I just pulled up the calendar. For April, those will be due Wednesday, April 4th.
Okay.
And I'll send a reminder out as we get closer, a couple of
Okay.
reminders.
Is that for the 3 sets, science, social studies, and what?
And mathematics.
Okay.
Great.
Board Member McClellan.
I just wanted to share my thanks for streamlining this process so that we can have such a good, orderly process going forward. I really appreciate it. I think it's respectful of the citizens who have taken their time to serve on these committees. Every once in a while at the local level, I would watch citizens participate in committees where they gave the gift of their life's work and life's experience to give their important input, only to have elected officials kind of rip it apart later. And while we might have minor adjustments, I really like that giving the committees this kind of a heads up about where are the areas of concern allows them to bring in the interested witnesses so they can be ready to talk about why they went in the direction that they did. So I really appreciate their service and also the orderly process. So thank you for making that happen.
Thank you. And I'll give the credit over to our chair and vice chair, as they were very instrumental in helping with the thinking through these processes.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Board Member Rankin.
I just a comment from what I've heard out in the field, and to reiterate that these standards are optional. Some constituents believe that if we have standards, they have to be higher, but we have to hold the students accountable to those standards before they get a high school diploma, if I take it to the end of their conversation. So I think we need to keep in mind what our rules are for these standards, and again, they're optional. I believe some
Wait a minute.
teachers, I'm sorry.
Optional? Meet
So-
or exceed?
Right, districts are obligated to meet or exceed the state standards, but they can have their own
They have
standards.
their own, but they have to meet or exceed.
Okay,
state
I'm
standards.
sorry, I
Yeah.
misspoke.
Sorry.
Meet or exceed. So if the students do not meet the standards, they are held back, or they don't get a diploma?
So the districts are accountable for having local standards that meet or exceed what the state has set, and by standards we mean the expectations for learning. So, and then districts have their own policies around how they assess their students' mastery of those standards, and they have their own policies regarding advancement. And
So-
they set their own graduation requirements based on the state guidelines.
So when we talk about standards, and our constituents do, they need to talk to their local school districts to see exactly how it's implemented in their district.
Yes.
Thank you.
Was there another question or comment?
Okay.
Thank you very much. When
Thank
will
you.
the binders be distributed?
We will work on getting those as soon as possible for you.
Oh, by the way, these were great. Thank you.
Yeah, they are great. So, colleagues, our next item is scheduled to go from 10 to 11:30. Do we want to interrupt for a break in the middle of it, or should we take a break right now?
Quick one.
Quick one. Quick is relative on this board. 10 minutes? So that, we call that 10-minute break Durham time, which is. No, yeah. Thanks for your patience. Next item on our agenda is consideration of Credo's request for student personally identifiable information for their 2 studies into charter schools. I ask that staff and Credo researchers give us a presentation before we take a motion. Commissioner?
Yes. So thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. I'm going to turn this over to Jill Stacy, our data privacy analyst, and Marsha Bohannon, our chief information officer. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Good morning, everybody. Hope everyone is doing better as time goes on. I hear that it wasn't the best night, so we're here with a couple of research requests, as Katie said, and there's 2 of them, and you've got the information in your packet. But first, I want to introduce our guests here. They're here from Stanford University, and we've got Dr. Lauren Birnbaum. Did I say that right? And Dr. Mackie Raymond. And you haven't been here before, but Mackie has been here. You might remember, I think it was in September of 2016.
Pueblo.
It was in Pueblo.
Wasn't it?
Yeah, we just, and she found a good place to eat on the way back to the airport. So we're all trying to figure out where that is. But they've been here before, and as you probably read in your packets, we presented a research request at that time, and that was approved. So one of these studies that we've got in front of you is a continuation of that study. They're asking for additional years worth of data, and the actual data that they're asking for, the data elements have not changed. So the actual data, research questions haven't changed. They just want to continue the study. So that's one of the research requests that we've got on the table in front of us. The other one on school improvement is follow-on research based on some research that they did that had been ongoing for some time as well on school closures. And the difference in the second school study, or the second research study, sorry, is that the research questions have changed. And you might remember that we've had a lot of discussion about our process and what to bring to you and what not. The reason we're bringing this in particular to you is that even though they're asking for the same data, they've changed the research questions and they've expanded it. So we want to make sure you're aware of how they're using Colorado data. We don't want to just, here's the data, you can do what you want with. We want to make sure, bring that back to you, make sure they're still in line with what your strategic priorities are. So just to sort of recap that, the first one, the questions haven't changed. They're just asking for additional data. The second one, there's changes in that. So what we want to do today was focus primarily on the second one, but we can do it however you would like. We can go through both of them in detail. I think there's also some value in talking about some of the results that they've found in the research that they've already done. So we've asked them to provide a little bit of that, and we can do that as much as makes sense, as much as you want to hear. I want to kind of take your lead on how you want us to proceed. The other change that we've done a little bit more of since last time we've been here is we've included a couple of board members in our review process, the actual process that we follow to get here. So we want to thank Board Member Rankin and Goff for attending our meetings. They'll probably tell you they're sort of grueling a little bit, trying to dig down and figure out, what questions to ask and what we do understand and what we don't understand. So, but we really appreciate that they've been willing to hang in there with us. So that's another thing we can do too, is talk a little bit more about that process. We've got a section in our presentation that kind of walks you through the questions that we ask and, how we got there. So Jill would be happy to take you through that, and then we can turn it over to Mackie and Lauren. Does that sound, you want to talk a little bit about the process first?
Colleagues, do you want to look at the process, or
do you want to go straight to the research studies?
My sense was in reading the material and then going going back through the process, and I thought, oh gosh, we did a good job. We really did tee in the kinds of questions that we wanted to make sure that you asked for in the process. For me personally, there wasn't another question that I thought we forgot to ask, but I think that's something to bring forward. If there was some other information that we should be having in the overall process, just to give researchers and staff a heads up what we're going to be asking. Or maybe that'll just emerge as we talk today. What do you think? Do you want to go back through the process again?
No. Well, I want to ask, who funded it before? Who funded it now?
No, right now we're talking about the process when a researcher comes forward to us. How do we make this work for them, for our staff and for us? And then we can get to your question, Board Member Flores.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So my perspective may vary from that of some of the other board members, but for me, what's always most important is the transparency for the people whose data is being used. So the process by which you seek and confirm the consent for the use of the data is the most important thing to me, and I'm always a bit less concerned with wherever your research happens to go, provided that the people whose data is at stake are fully informed and have had a chance to give their consent and have given it, and that they have a chance to opt out in the event that it goes in a direction they weren't informed about. So that's the part of the process that's of most interest to me, much more so than where the research happens to go, which I regard as perhaps more your business. I'm not here to hem in anyone's intellectual pursuit. Just want to make sure that my concern is just that the process is transparent for the people whose data is used. So that's my greatest interest.
Okay.
Board Member Flores.
I just wanted to ask a question of my colleague. So what do you mean if the research goes somewhere else?
I'm less concerned with the findings of their study than I am with the degree to which the process is transparent and empowering for those whose data is being utilized. I just want to make sure the rights of those whose data is utilized are respected, and that they have a transparent process, and that's my chief concern.
Board Member Goff and Board Member Rankin, do you
Finished.
please?
Okay, I'm sorry. I asked that question, but I just want to, I've been following this research that you have written for years. I mean that, and the...
Board Member Flores, can we just stay on the process for a minute, and then we'll move on to the research itself. This is more about I think it's more about any research group coming forward. Board Member Goff, I'm sorry, Board Member Rankin.
Then my question is, who was privy to how this was going to go on? I wasn't privy to, research is research. They in their institution, they have people who say, yes, the research can go on. And then they come to us, and then we have, yes, they look over the research and they say, yes, it's not going to hurt anybody and such, and so we say yes. So what has happened since then? What other thing has happened that I don't know about that you guys have changed about how the process works?
If I may,
Changed anything?
maybe I can help here.
Just one moment, please.
That's what today is all about. It's actually painting a picture of a reminder to all of us except Rebecca, and Rebecca technically is the only one who was not on the board, including Dr. Scheffel was on the board, when in 2016 we went about and approved our process for the course between the board,
So what has
the
changed?
staff that does this work, and how we're going to handle these types of requests. So where we are today is a presentation to the board of a request. And so in the meantime, since, fall, maybe, I don't remember, we have been aware, Joyce and I joined the staff as sort of a review group to look at this request and ask our questions, sort of represent you all in the decision perhaps, the presentation to the board and making the decision as a board about whether this request was going to go forward. Where we are today is at that point.
So you're on the committee for,
Yeah, we have been, I don't know if you call it on the committee. We've been sitting down with staff to learn about how the process works here at CDE. You know, taking up our kind of representation of you all in asking questions ahead of time, so that when it does come to the board, we've saved some time, actually.
well, see, I wasn't even aware that you were on the board because nobody asked me questions, so that's why.
Now, today's the time for you to ask
Yeah,
questions.
this is the time
Well,
for
maybe
you to
give-
do that.
And I thought I would just start asking questions and.
Could we have a presentation?
We had one person who brought up a question regarding process.
Right.
And talking about these two requests is a separate issue. So we need to just square up where we are now. Are we done talking process?
I think
That's
so.
the
I didn't
chair's
hear-
decision.
I didn't
And
hear
ready
any
to move on.
suggestions. Board Member Rankin.
I'd like to just back up a little bit more and say that in the past, Ms. Stacy and Ms. Bohannon have been in front of us, and we've had a lot of questions. When I sat in on what they had gone through, it became very clear to me that I had a lot more questions in that meeting. Since then, receiving all these documents and reading all of the documents, I think the process is very clear. So what in fact, I wish I had that the first time I sat down. It would have made a lot more sense to me. So what I'm looking for is a little summary of the study and then the results, where we are with some of that. And I know that's in here. I've read it already, but I think some people might want a little review of that. And very brief on that, I think maybe Board Member Goff would concur on that, and to really isolate Part 1, what we're voting on today, from Part 2. So the emphasis on Part 1 is, I think, where we are right now. And again, I think the results are way down at the bottom, but the process was extremely thorough to get to that point. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you for the opportunity to sit in on the committee and then to see all this information. So that's where I am. Board Member Goff?
Ditto.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Super.
It was a great learning experience.
And I want
That's
to make sure
helpful.
we get back to Board Member McClellan's question too. So we'll make sure we get that when we go through this. So.
You're on.
So I think the best thing based on that is to turn it over to our experts here. And if you guys could also include the discussion about the opt-in, at some point in yours to make sure that we address that particular question. And since Board Member Rankin asked about, isolating the first one from the second one, maybe we should talk a little bit about, maybe we should talk a little bit about the first study, and then we can clarify exactly what we're voting on for that, and start with that, and then we'll go to the second study.
Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Schroeder, Vice Chair Rankin, and other members of the board. We really appreciate the opportunity to join you today and to make our case for continuing our data partnership together. We, I think, share a real strong interest in identifying ways that every student in Colorado can enroll and attend a highly successful school. And so whether we're looking at all schools, whether we're looking at district schools, whether we're looking at magnet schools, whether we're looking at charter schools, our mission is not to pick a particular form of school, but to identify schools that are successful and try to understand what about them we can learn from to help other schools improve. So I think that we are joined in common cause, and for the last 9 years have really appreciated the support that you have provided us in terms of allowing us to use your student level data, and I hope that we have in fact delivered back to you some value in terms of the research findings that we have. Our goal is always to have policy actionable research. We don't take policy positions. Our mantra is we let the data speak, and so we believe that we are honest and true and impartial stewards of research to provide decision makers such as yourself as rigorous a set of analyses as we can possibly produce on topics that matter to the decisions that you wrestle with every day. So that's our sort of preamble about who we are and what we do. My colleague, Dr. Bierbaum, is the manager of our institutional review board at Stanford. There's a real reason why I delegated that work, and she's about to tell you why.
So we are deeply grateful to be here before you, and also want to endorse your experience with how rigorous and deep the Colorado research approval process is. We also wanted to be able to reassure you that Stanford's Institutional Review Board, their IRB, also has a similarly intensive process with sort of 4 key components to their review. So first and foremost is the scholarly review, to make sure that the research under proposition has value to the conversation, both to the field of education and education research, but also to the stakeholders who potentially benefit from that research, so again, to the families and students in Colorado. There's also a very intensive ethics review to make sure that any information that is using data that comes from those stakeholders is managed, accessed, stored, analyzed, and reported on appropriately. And so that's really the deep and sort of like, that is the charge of any institutional review board, is to make sure that all of our research is in alignment, not only with sort of industry standard practice, but actually highest standard practice. That also includes a review of security concerns, and so in addition to data stewardship and being respectful of the human subjects, there's also a review around how that data is technologically and physically stored, and I believe you have our data governance plan in your packets. We actually exceed the IRB's requirements there. And then finally, on the perhaps the more pragmatic side, the IRB is also charged with protecting the university, right, and making sure that not only is the research in alignment with all of these practices, policies, and procedures around human subjects and data security, but also, frankly, making sure that no individual research at the university is putting at risk the university's reputation or, frankly, the university's resources via the mishandling of either research subjects or data. And so we have a two-pronged protective practice in which we go through an incredibly rigorous review around the research itself, but then also a risk assessment to make sure that the university is not making vulnerable themselves by way of making vulnerable Colorado data.
I would just amplify that to go to your specific concern. The data that we are suggesting be shared with us for our research purposes typically we never request any personally identified information, with the exception of the unique student identifier in Colorado. But we take our practice one step further, and we ask that before the information is shared with us, that the data people here at the department scramble the student ID so that we don't actually see the real ID. And we ask them to hold on to a crosswalk file of both of those factors in case we want to update, as we are asking you today to do that, so that they can unscramble, get back to the real ID, add new years of data, scramble again, and give it back to us. So we are a step above the usual standards for protecting personally identified information. Because these are data that are already collected for other purposes, the state here and other research communities have set the standard that since we're not looking to identify individuals, we are only looking at general practices and patterns across data, that allowing individuals to not participate can skew the numbers that we would be able to use, and therefore the findings that we would be able to bring to you. And because of that risk, this particular form of research is generally viewed as not requiring any kind of identification or requiring opt-out opportunities. We would find it very difficult to bring you what we would consider to be best of breed analyses if we lost even a few thousand records, because we never know where they go away from, right? So we wouldn't know where the gaps were, and we wouldn't know what to make of that. So we would ask your consideration that we would be allowed to use these data without parental opt-out, and with the confidence that we know no students in Colorado, we never talk to students in Colorado, we don't interview them, we don't survey them. All we're looking for is to use that data to find these general patterns across all the data. I hope that that answers your question.
Board Member Sheffel?
So with respect to the PII, and maybe you've already discussed this, but I just wasn't sure how you were protecting the data. You know, there's static data, there's dynamic data, there's encryption, various levels of encryption. Maybe that's described somewhere, although I didn't see these documents. But how can parents be assured that you are exceeding the industry standards on encrypting data so that hackers, I mean, we have all these examples in the industry where great data systems get hacked, and the parents are very concerned about that.
So let me just start out by saying our interests are aligned with yours, because as we say, a single breach is career ending for us. We have these partnerships with a number of other states as well, and I have no doubt that if we had a single breach in any state data, that all of our state partnerships would go down. And that would be career limiting. We have extremely refined procedures for taking data from your state. We only accept a high security data transfer protocol, so that for a limited period of time, there's a window that opens up in the State Department of Education and a window opens up in our high security data center at Stanford. This is the data center where all of the super high vulnerable data for national security purposes or medical research is kept. It's considered tertiary and quadruple level requirements when the industry only requires primary and secondary. So we go all the way to the top. And a little door opens up on each side for about 30 seconds, and the data is transferred in and then shut down. At the point at which it's brought into our high security data center, it is moved through 4 different levels of encryption to move into our server. None of our people can access our own server, which is sitting in the high security data center, without going through their own 4 levels of encryption. That's 2 more than is required by industry standards. And we ensure that no information, so we keep all of the data on the high security server. We have installed on that server all of the analytic software that we need. So we never draw down data to our own desktop level. All of the data stays in the high security center. All of the analysis is done in the high security center. And the only thing that's allowed to transfer back to us are the summative analytic findings. So we can bring down a table that shows what our regression analyses show us, but that's not individual data. That's millions of records that have gone into those numbers. So we never touch the data itself, literally, and we never allow any researcher to take any of that data out of the high security center.
So I appreciate the 4 levels of encryption. What does it mean to say that tokenization is the strongest and most cost-effective data security measure? What is that? What is tokenization?
I'm sorry, Dr. Scheifel, I don't think I said that. Can you help?
No, you didn't. I'm quoting from an article I read. I'm saying you got 4 levels, which is awesome, and even the people that access it, so that's very high standard. I'm just saying, do you understand? I don't understand what that means. I was just looking at some groups that put out guidelines for encryption of data.
Tokenization?
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, what? No, it's not blockchain. No, tokenization means that you are substituting proxies for high vulnerable variables.
Right.
And we think that we do that with our scrambled ID, and we continue to look for ways to add additional security, not with Colorado, but with another state. So the tokenization is making sure that no high vulnerable variables are even in the data set to begin with. We can't do there are 5 steps to our research that need the scrambled ID in order for us to do the data setup. At that point, we could tokenize if we wanted to. Instead, what we're doing, and we're trialing this with another state, is we're actually thinking about scrambling the school IDs as well and keeping that scramble off of the high security. Once that's scrambled, take the matching file off of the high stakes, high security server and store that elsewhere. That's not PII, that's just school IDs. But then we'd have scrambled schools and scrambled students. And even if anything got hacked at that point, there would be no way that anybody could analyze the data and understand what was going on.
Thank you.
Board Member Rankin.
I know you want to get on with this presentation, but since we're on this sensitive topic,
I'm here all day.
I just wanted to say that you mentioned the opt-out within your particular, we can't have that because of the information you want. But what about now that we have opt-out out of our test scores, how is that going to reflect on your information or the information you need? I don't want it to change the outcome for our state just because of that.
So opt-out has been a concern not only in Colorado, but in a number of other states. And the state now has new practices and policies. Did you want to just speak to that briefly?
Which?
The 95%?
Oh, the 95, and they're aware of the 95%.
I just wonder how that's going to affect the
So-
information you're looking for in the study that you're doing.
So we have school level information that allows us to identify which schools have been deleted because of the 95. And we can then make some estimations based on the attributes of the students in those schools, whether or not they are considered outlier schools or whether they are sufficiently representative of the schools for whom we have existing opt-in or school level data, and make some determination about whether we are going to have biased estimates or not.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So I think there was another question over here, and Dr. Flores, I think you wanted to ask about who supports our studies?
Yes, who supported your studies before and throughout these studies?
So we're very fortunate that we have a broad base of funding support. We are also fortunate that we sit in the middle of Silicon Valley, where there are some really, really, really affluent people on both sides of the political aisle. And so our funding base has branched from folks who support specific kinds of school choice, like the Walton Family Foundation or the Robertson Foundation in New York City, to folks who are much more interested in finding out how to make schools better for all kids. And that includes folks like the Charles and Helen Schwab Foundation, the people who bring you Schwab Financial, the Emerson Collective, which is the funding residual for the widow of Steve Jobs at Apple. You guys might have heard of Netflix. We are lucky enough to have Reed Hastings as one of our supporters, and he is a strong advocate for improving schools, particularly for first-generation students who are going to school for the first time in the United States. We have local foundation support when we do studies in local areas, so we've had Shellis Bodman in New York City, don't know that you would know them, the Fairbanks Foundation in Indiana, 2 local family foundations in Texas, the John and Laura Arnold Foundation, the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation. Okay, can I stop now?
Sounds like PBS.
Yeah. So putting together the data agreements to do the studies is part of the work, and putting together the funding coalitions for the work is the other part of the work. And we try to make sure that we have representation from all sides of the issue.
And who gives
Microphone.
the biggest portion of your fund? The biggest portion of your fund comes from whom?
We don't have a biggest portion. That's the point. We have a fully diversified funding base, so that we obviously have to be, if we claim that we are impartial in the work that we do, we have to be impartial also into...
I feel I have to ask.
No, it's fair. It's a fair question.
Yes.
We also feel like we should be impartial in terms of a willingness to take money from all sides. And so we don't want anybody to be perceived as having an overhang on us by funding.
Mhm.
And so we have intentionally made a case for making sure that we have a broad base of funders.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you for asking.
Some high-level results, or do you want to go to the motions? Yes, please. Some
High-level results. All right. When I sat before you 18 months ago, I was asking for your permission to do a study of charter management organizations using Colorado along with 26 other states. We completed that study in the fall of last year and released those results. There were 3 basic questions we wanted to answer. 1, do students who are enrolled in charter management organizations, these are networks of charter schools that have a common senior management structure but operate a number of schools, do students in those kinds of schools do better than students who attend independent charter schools, what you might call mom and pop or singletons or whatever? And the answer to that was yes, that students in charter management organizations learn on average about 17 days more learning every year than students who are enrolled in singleton charter schools. And then the question was, well, why is that? And so part of our second research question was, there's a second research question attended to that. One was, what about profit versus nonprofit? And our findings found that the nonprofit CMOs, while they did produce as well education that was on par or slightly better than traditional public schools, their results were much more negative than the results that we found for nonprofit charter management organizations. And this bears, I think, a little bit of support for the common concern that resources are not allocated equivalently across both those settings.
So repeat that again. I just want to.
Okay.
I wanted to sink
Okay.
in.
Here we go.
Nonprofit.
They do well. For-profit, they do about the same or slightly better than regular school, traditional public schools, but much less than the nonprofit. Okay. So it's like that.
Networks.
Yes. Okay. Then we said, okay, what about this? And the biggest finding from our study that we did that was news to us and was actually, I think, a pretty important mechanism is that charter management organizations have somehow been able to crack the code on scaling. So that if you look at the performance of the new schools as they expand their networks, those schools come out as well performing as the rest of the portfolio. And their new school performance is much, much better, substantially better than what happens with new schools that are singleton charter schools. And so there's been a codification of what makes a good school and the ability to transfer that. And from the standpoint of trying to improve schools for all students, this is an incredibly important finding, that it is possible to codify what makes a good school in a way that other people can latch onto and adopt. And so I'm very encouraged with that because I think it sets up what I believe is an obligation for charter schools. Now, this is outside of research, but I believe that charter schools have an obligation for transparency, not just about their performance, but about their practice. And we've been advocating for years, as we've watched charter schools improve each of our studies, they get a little bit better. They're not doing enough to share what they know how to do with other charter schools and with traditional public schools. This is just now the sort of the new wave of what's going on in the charter community, and we are all for it. We want to study whether the things they do actually work, and we'll be back later to you for that request. But for now, the fact that we can demonstrate that they know how to do this puts even more of an imperative on them, that if you know how to do this, you really ought to share it.
And you're talking about nonprofit CMOs.
Yes, ma'am, I am.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
There was a recent study in the American Educational Research Association in which there was about foundation monies and where foundation monies goes now that to schools, to public schools and charter schools. And so the finding was that somehow after Race to the Top, the monies that foundations are giving were given to those individuals or those districts and states that got the money to the Race to the Top. And that foundations, basically, these are big foundations, are giving their money to, for lobbying. 70% of the money is going for lobbying, and 30% of the money is going to lobbying. Lobbying 70 and 30 for CMOs. Now, didn't say which CMOs they were going, but I think they mentioned KIPP, so those are big, for-profit CMOs.
That's not a for-profit, ma'am.
Well,
It's a
they're
nonprofit
big.
organization. They're big. They have
They're big.
122 schools, but they're not
I
for-profit.
don't know if they mentioned KIPP, but so.
But your point is?
So I'm kind of thinking that those public schools that used to get the monies are not getting them, but that these charter schools are getting them. And I'm concerned about the amount of money that's going to lobbying. You see it. You just walk across the street here, and you'll run into lobbyists who are lobbying for charters and such. Those are the people that you meet. So I can see that a lot of money is going, because it's a new thing. I mean, it's the new thing. And I'm concerned about good public neighborhood schools that would be and have been so good to Americans for years. And because of the new bangles and all of that, we may be kind of losing out to charter management companies. I'm glad to hear that they're nonprofit, but that concerns me.
Thank you, Dr.
Especially
Flores.
with that.
Could I ask a question just to
Well-
make sure we keep straight? Thank you. I appreciate your comments.
Well, no, there's a corollary, because she mentioned something that you mentioned yesterday, and that is that they're being more accountable and that they're providing information to the public about their expenditure. For instance, you mentioned yesterday Eva
Dr. Flores,
Moskowitz
we need
yesterday.
to move on.
And Eva Moskowitz, the reason she's been in the courts is because she's not open. She is not. She does not provide accountability. She's not accountable to how she spends the money, and she gets a lot of money.
Could
So
we talk about this
accountability is a big
research,
one, and I'm so glad
please?
that you mentioned accountability and that they're being more
I'm just trying to
accountable
figure out which-
because to the public, because that is so important.
Thank you,
very
Dr.
much.
Flores. I just want to make, based on two different studies, what you just described to us, that's the National School, Charter School Study 3 or 2. Am I correct? I'm just trying to make sure that we make the right motions here. I'm sorry.
Thank you for clarifying. I was describing to you the results from the last charter school study that we did, which focused on charter management organizations.
Right. And
The
you're-
extension of that now is we'd like
3.
to pool all the schools together and update for the National Charter School Study 3.
Okay, so may I have a motion, please?
I move to approve the research request from Credo to use student PII for research for their National Charter School Study 3.
Thank you, that's a proper motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Board Member Goff.
Madam Chair.
Thank you, by the way, both of you, for all the work you've done. Yes, Mr.
I had a
Board Member
question.
Durham.
I'm
Sure.
sorry I didn't get it in
No,
on
now's the time for discussion.
time. I did read the entire, at least 100 and some page study that.
I'm sorry to
you
hear
sent
that.
down, yeah. Well,
Lots
I
of
thought-
questions coming my way.
No, I don't, no, I thought it was very, it was very interesting.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say I couldn't put it down, but it.
Couldn't put it down, Steve.
But it was readable. So, and I thought those results deserved to be well disseminated, and I think I passed that suggestion along to my colleagues and a few legislators and that sort of thing. But how do you go about trying to disseminate the results of this work in a way that it gets in the hands, effectively gets in the hands of policymakers?
Thank you for your question, Member Durham. So I think one of the ways that Credo differentiates itself from other public policy researchers, particularly in academia, is that we understand that when a study is done, it's only 50% done. That if we're dedicated to producing actionable policy research findings, it's unlikely that policymakers are going to beat a path to our door, and so it's our obligation to beat a path to their door. We have a manager of communication on our team, and she works tirelessly to make sure that we maintain complete files of all of our partners in all of the states that might be interested in our results, the chairs of the education committees in all of the state legislatures. We have a Friends of Credo list that involves policy action groups and other interest groups across the country. And we have a 750-member media list. They have all opted in to our media list to ask to see the results. So with every single study, our first initiative is to broadcast, and then, the first initiative is to make sure that we do policy briefings before we release the report to our partners to make sure that they're comfortable with the results and they know what's in them, so that if they get any contacts, they're prepared. Then the second thing is this broadcast dissemination. And then the third thing is, depending on the findings, we will do targeted follow-up. And certainly at any point in which we receive a request from any of our partners, we are always available to do extended briefings or policy discussions or other consultative sessions to help people use the findings in the work that they're doing.
And thank you. And have you ever really focused your research in on and something that, if you haven't, is there a way to do it, or something you would even consider in terms of, let's take the education approach rather than the structure. For example, I think some of the very best performing high schools in Colorado are charter, essentially classical academies. Have you tried to compare that methodology of teaching, compare those outcomes to, say, the traditional public classroom, and if so, what have those results been?
That's an excellent question. We've actually looked into this and even did sort of micro studies to explore the feasibility of doing this. One of the things that we found pretty quickly on is that almost every single school claims that they are rigorous, college-ready, college preparatory schools, and in order to validate that, it would require actually going in and observing what the curriculum structure looks like, what the instructional model looks like, what the standards for grading look like. We've not undertaken that. We have done small area studies. Dr. Bierbaum just finished a big study in New Orleans, Memphis, and Nashville that was what we call deep dive study about what goes on within schools, and found that even the so-called alternative models of schools, ones that don't claim that they're college ready, do a lot of the same things that college ready schools do. They just don't do it quite as well in many cases. So we'd love more opportunity to study that, but we'd have to develop a better methodology.
And do you have you done anything on relative to Waldorf schools and trying to?
No, I haven't. Is that a pet of yours? A pet interest?
Yes, it is. It's a very personal question.
Actually, I'm interested in also. It's frequent. It was frequently used in Germany.
Yeah.
Is it
I
sort
know
of an abracadabra to American educators in that the reading comes forward without the kind of teaching that you're accustomed to seeing, and so people think it's magic. So
it's like mother's milk.
But
the pictures in my head are not good. More to this?
Well,
Board Member Goff.
I think I'm right. I believe there's a Waldorf school in Jefferson County.
Yes, there is.
And
there are a couple private
others.
ones around.
Yes.
There are a number of them actually in the Front Range.
Carbondale too, by the way.
Yeah, they're pretty popular.
Buffalo, New York, and Tucson.
Yeah. There you go. Can we call the vote?
Well, may I make
Board Member Sheffield?
Yeah, I just want to say thanks for your research. They're great questions. I'd love an opportunity for the board to pose some research questions potentially for some of these policy think tanks, just because your questions are excellent, and we probably have questions too for which our data could be helpful. I guess I feel like because parents can't opt out of this, I feel uncomfortable with it. I feel like there are ways to deal with missing data and incomplete data sets that would still allow parents, and I don't think there'd be a ton of them that would opt out, but I think parents deserve a right to opt out of these kinds of studies, given that we're sharing PII, but I appreciate your work.
Board Member Flores?
You know,
Quick.
God, why always quick for me? I speak so slowly. One of the things I know you said about the competition out, and it is competition that they don't want to share the good things that are coming out of the schools. And that's not only in charter schools, that's in public schools too. Within schools, you find teachers, and I've taught for close to 50 years, and you know, these last years that I taught, I found that people guarded their, you know, their materials and what they were doing, and they didn't want to share. And I thought that was so unlike, you know, teachers as a whole that I had worked with before, that if you found something that was really working, you really wanted to share with other teachers. So it's not just charter schools. It's also that competition in public schools as well. And I don't find that very, you know, positive. I think that we should share what we know. And teachers certainly are that type of people, and somehow we're creating teachers that are not what I would call teachers, that
I'm trying to.
like to share. Call the question.
Thank you. Ms. Cordial, would you call the roll, please?
Board Member Durham.
Yes.
Board Member Flores.
Yes.
Board Member Goff.
Yes.
Board Member McClellan.
Yes.
Board Member Rankin.
Yes.
Board Member Shuffle.
No.
Board Member Schroeder.
Yes.
Thank you. That motion passes 6-1.
Thank you.
Dr. Raymond, would you be kind enough now to go to study number 2?
Study
Am
number
I getting
2.
this right?
Yep, it's study
Okay.
number 2.
Thank you.
So prior to the new way of requesting data from the Colorado Department of Education, we had data sharing agreements that were, shall we say, more loosely structured. And out of that arrangement, we started 7 or 8 years ago looking at what happens when trying to look at what happens when schools are closed. We felt like this was a whole area that was not well understood. We didn't know how many schools are closed across the country or within states. We didn't know which of the schools were closed, and we most importantly didn't know what happened to students when those schools closed. And so bit by bit, we finally figured out a way to do the study in a way that we thought was rigorous, and bit by bit, we got enough partnerships that wanted to answer that question. So this past fall, we released a study on school closure. And what we found was a little bit surprising. The largest number of schools that are closed are traditional public schools. That's not completely surprising because more schools are traditional public schools than charter schools. What was a little bit surprising was the share of underperforming traditional public schools that are closed is much smaller, less than half of the percentage of underperforming charter schools that are closed. Perhaps the insight that was most difficult for us to swallow was that in the charter school world, where charter schools were seriously underperforming, a very small proportion of them had action taken against them. And this was over an extended period of time. So we feel as though there is an authorizer gap in that responsibility, because the deal is you're supposed to do well or you're not going to be renewed. We found lots and lots of schools in both settings. The schools that were closed were not the worst schools. And in fact, in both settings, a number of schools were closed even though their most recent performance had indicated that they were on a positive trajectory. They hadn't gotten out of the low performing category, but they had obviously picked up and were starting to move, and they were closed.
And these were charter schools?
Both. Both.
Okay.
Okay, so kind of a sad story on the school closure side in terms of the practice of school closure. But we really wanted to know what happened to students after their school was closed. Clearly, as a school is moving towards closure, enrollments go down. So the good news is that the average size of schools that are closed is much smaller in their final years than schools that are allowed to remain open. But those schools don't do much in terms of trying to find new settings for their students. And so, believe it or not, more than 2/3 of the school students who are coming out of closing schools go to schools that are equivalent or worse in their academics. Because remember, we don't close the worst schools.
That's Gilpin.
And if students go to those schools, their learning continues to decline. But if we can find positive school settings for these kids, if we can find schools that are better to send these students to, their academic gains are substantial, and we now know they're sustained. So we think there's a policy insight there that's useful for all settings, at the district level, at the charter level, and also at the state board level.
Can I ask you, did you actually look into the reason for the closures? Because there are other reasons than performance.
Sure. Almost all of the closures that we identified as closures were closure for low performance and not for financial problems.
Okay.
Just to be clear.
Okay.
But they are coincident, as you must know, right? Declining enrollments because a school is starting to slide means the school is having a harder time. And so it's
too expensive.
Their budget is still largely fixed. It's a vicious cycle. But the schools that we looked at were mostly driven by bad performance, not by budget. Okay, so here's where I get a little nerdy, so excuse me if I get excited. When we were doing this work, we actually saw something crazy, which was that there were schools that kept disappearing. Like, we would see them in the data, they were low performing, we'd look to the next period, they weren't there anymore. Wait a second. So we'd do it again. Nope, they're still not there. We thought we had a coding problem, whatever. Turns out, what we identified was that we can see some schools, we don't know how many of them there are, but we can see some schools who are in a low performing category in an earlier period, and we watch them leave the low performing category, right? And that's what you want, right?
Right.
But we have no idea how many there are, and whether they are all substantially suburban schools or whether they are actually stories of revitalization. And so we come to you today for permission to do the quantitative work with Colorado's data to look at how extensive is this practice, considering the results of the school improvement grant evaluation that was done a couple years ago that showed no impact for all of that resource. If we can identify schools that are actually getting this done, this is a huge learning opportunity. And I don't want to miss that, and I don't want to miss the opportunity to stimulate more focus on that. So that's the reason for our second proposal.
So that actually aligns with the work that we've been doing in Colorado in terms of finding ways to help low-performing schools.
Yeah.
Which might be why Ms. Pearson is sitting at the table with us.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
The nearness of you.
I like it.
Do you want to make a comment about that, Ms. Pearson? No, okay. So I've lost my motion maker? Yeah, sorry. Sorry. We're moving along here, I hope.
May I make a motion?
I think we've got it.
Oh, okay.
I move to approve the research request from Credo to use PII for research for their charter school improvement study.
I second it.
Thank you.
Is that the right?
Point of clarification,
Motion, I don't
it's
think
all
that's it.
schools.
I'm sorry.
Just a point of clarification, ma'am. It's all schools? We're going to be looking at both district schools and charter schools?
Yeah.
And the school improvement study?
I'm sorry. I think I needed to read the second one.
Yes. Well, you did, and it
No,
does
I
say,
didn't. I
it
read the
does say
first one.
charter, and that's incorrect.
Okay, so.
And some of us should be given
Did I
the
do the
right
right
to
It's not
to
your fault.
propose it too.
It's not your fault. It should be all schools, right?
Yes, it sounds like it should be.
Yeah, it should be all schools. All schools, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
I read the right one.
Not fair, not fair.
But It's called the Charter School Improvement Study.
Is it called the Charter
Well,
School
that's what I
Improvement
wanted
Study?
to do. I don't
No,
know.
No, ma'am,
it's
it's
not
called the
called the
school,
Charter School.
it's just called the School Improvement
It's
Study.
the
Oh,
school
so
improvement.
if I just cross out that word charter,
That is correct.
I'll try it again. I move to approve the research request from Credo to use student PII for research for their school improvement study. Sorry.
I second that.
Thank you, ma'am.
Call the roll, please. Oh, do you have questions? Sure.
Yes.
Dr.
I just
Schiff.
wanted to ask about the way you collect the data. Is it still the case that parents can't opt out, or do
That
you
is
collect it
correct.
in a different way? They can't opt out. Okay. Is there any appetite among the board to amend so the parents can opt out?
Nope. Not if it messes up the study.
Can
And
you
we
s-
know that from all the opt-outs, how
Which
much
is-
information we
They're
don't
going to
get.
scramble.
Can you speak to those states where they do allow parents to opt out and how you deal with incomplete data sets?
I'm sorry, but we've never encountered a request like that.
So you never allow the parents to opt out
No,
on
ma'am.
any of your research?
No, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
Board Member Durham?
So, thank you, Madam Chair. So this study is, I guess we would, if we were to put it in Colorado terms, it's schools that are getting off the clock in some way, that have been demonstrated to be failing or low performing, but somehow they, over time, and over how much time have they been moving from one category to another, have you found? What is this, how long does this, are you going to focus on schools that move in a year, or move in 5 years, or move at all, or?
So one of the interesting questions is, what is the periodicity of improvement? So does it take a couple of years for schools to exit, or 5 years, or 4 years, or right away? So it is part of our research questions to look at the periodicity, or the period it takes before that improvement becomes apparent. Next time I come, I can give you the answer.
That's fine.
Yes.
So to some extent, it's something that we are looking at anyway in terms of our schools that are on the clock. We are talking about how much time do we give them before we take, we take some kind of action, how much time, we give them some time, and then we have to consider whether we should do something differently, et cetera. Mr. Durham?
Well, just one follow-up. Since you, if I understood your earlier testimony, you don't try to sort or measure methodologies. So how is it that you're going to make any determinations about why these particular schools get off the clock if you're not looking at, for example, this school is a classical approach, or this school, I don't know what the other variables even might be. This school's a Waldorf school. So what variables you're going to look at if you're not going to look at and advocate, essentially end up advocating a particular methodology?
So, as you know, we have partnerships with other states as well as Colorado, and our expectation is that we are going to sample schools in other states that have made these improvements and go in and do the deep dive that Dr. Bierbaum and her team are able to do in order to parse those effects.
Board Member Flores?
And to be fair to a district that I oversee, well, I don't oversee, I'm over Congressional District 1, which includes Denver. I think Denver does a great job of putting, if a school has been for quite a while not performing, this is a charter school or even a regular school, they don't give them 5 years. Depending, it's 2 years, 3 years, sometimes even 1 year. So if you don't get it together in 1 year, then, and they continuously evaluate. And I just wish we had more resources for the department to be able to do that kind of overseeing. And I know you're doing the best that you can, and you're doing a great job, and thank you. But I'm looking forward to the results of your study.
Madam Chair?
Board Member Durham?
Thank you. I think one of the problems with this is, I think that my personal observation after going through about 6 months of review of failing schools is the thing that, the common thread that gets them off the clock is that you're shining a spotlight on them, and there's probably a slight embarrassment factor. I just don't know that this is going to yield, if schools are now being identified as failing to the public and to the parents, that may be in and of itself what's making the difference. I don't know how you measure that, so I'm not convinced this is particularly valuable research.
That sort of dismisses all the work that our staff's doing with these
Right.
schools, Mr. Durham. Wow.
Well, I'm sure the staff intervention helps, but if you look at the, if you look at the results, Dr. Schroeder, that clearly you couldn't attribute, bouncing on and off the clock probably to anything other than, particularly when they go back and forth to when the spotlight's on them.
When that
and when the
happens,
spotlight's
then
off.
you might have a case, but right
But
now we
when
aren't
Ms.
there.
What Dr. Raymond is saying is that it's those schools that kind of just blinker off, and what happens to those schools after a while that you
Sorry.
don't hear about.
May I
Would
address?
you
Dr.
respond?
Dr. Raymond, yes.
So, Mr. Durham, I take your question, and there is a way to actually take a little bit of a look at that, because states vary in the degree to which they buckle down on accountability. And so we can look at the variation in terms of how much time states give schools. We can look at variations in terms of district participation in school improvement practices and see whether it's the supports from the district or from the governing side of schools, or whether it's the threat, it's the shaming and the threat of action, because we can take a look at both of those at the same time. I don't know that you can do that within a state because the accountability mechanism is constant across the state, but there's interstate variation that we can exploit to that purpose.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Raymond, any more comments you'd like to make? Oh, wait, let's do a vote. We didn't vote on this last one.
No, we did
Please.
not vote it.
Sorry.
You didn't call the question.
To approve the school improvement study. Board Member Durham.
No.
Board Member Flores.
Oh, I'm looking forward to this. Yes.
Board Member Goff.
Yes.
Board Member McClellan.
Yes.
Board Member Rankin.
Yes.
Board Member Shuffle.
No.
Board Member Schroeder.
Yes.
Thank you. That motion passes 5-2.
Thank you
Any
all.
more comments that you would like to make?
I'm sorry?
Since you've come all this way, do you have any more comments that you wanted to make?
No, just that I want to continue to express my thanks to the staff. They've really worked very hard with us. They've certainly put us through our paces. It's the most difficult data review process in the country. I can't say I love it, but I do respect it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Cordial, would you please announce executive session? No?
As we don't have anything scheduled for executive session, I think you all can.
What?
We have nothing?
What?
You can take a nice
Counselor,
moment.
do we have anything for exec session?
I don't know if, there may be a couple of loose ends people want to.
Okay.
You would
Please.
like one? Okay.
Yes.
The State Board will convene an executive session to receive legal advice on specific legal questions pursuant to 24-6-4023A Roman numeral 2 CRS and matters required to be kept confidential by federal law or rules or state statutes pursuant to 24-6-4023A Roman numeral 3 CRS.
Thank you. Do I have a motion to go into exec session?
So moved.
Thank you. Second? Thank you. So